Okay, so as I put out there, this is a sprinting application discussion that I'm posting to kind of complement some of the earlier information that I discussed in as far as sprinting is concerned. So we've kind of talked about some drills. I'm going to dig a little further and show you guys some other things you can do to kind of affect, the speed properties, particularly as it relates to non-track disciplines. Now, obviously, a lot of the principles will come from track and field, from the standpoint of how to improve speed, but we're going to look to see how we can apply this to field-based athletes. As we kind of go through, you'll sort of notice there are some citations in this presentation. I don't have I basically took parts of a presentation that I did at a conference and kind of put some of that in here. So if you see that, don't mind that. I don't have a citation slide at the end, but if you'd ever want me to share my sources, I'd be more than happy to do so. Okay, so when we look at sprinting, and these are some things that we've sort of discussed, but again, it's an important skill for non-track athletes. So I think sometimes we neglect the fact that sprinting is an actual skill, and it's more than just running fast. There's a lot more to sprinting than that, and one of the key determinants for success in a lot of the sports, for soccer, lacrosse, any sport where there's cyclic running action, a lot of the success is based on speed, and some of the mistakes that we make from from a performance aspect and from an injury prevention aspect is that we don't address pure speed as well as we should. So there's a high neuromuscular demand, so intermuscular and intramuscular coordination, large amount of force in the shortest amount of time. So part of the determinant of doing well, as I always talk about with speed, is being able to produce a large amount of force in a short amount of time. And we'll kind of talk about how different aspects of strength and conditioning can improve speed. Obviously, the best way to improve speed is by just sprinting, and then there's some other less specific means that can do so. But the intermuscular and intramuscular coordination aspect is very important, because we tend to neglect the effects of the nervous system on that has from doing and trying to improve on speed. So we'll look at that. Intermuscular just basically means the coordination between different muscles, and intramuscular coordination just looks at the coordination contraction wise of the individual muscles themselves. Okay, and here you have, so when you sprint, you have forces upwards to 5 times your body weight hitting the ground. So again, high neuromuscular demand, but also a high structural demand, given the fact that you have that much of your body weight, as you're sprinting at full speed, hitting the ground each time your foot strikes. So again, high degree of CNS activity. It's more than just running fast, so we have to improve that. Strength training can improve, but only up to a point. So this is an important thing to look at. So general strength training can help somebody. If you have individuals of low training status who don't have a lot of force production abilities, that can actually help them get faster. So in a lot of my experience with athletes, I have been able to see athletes improve their speed simply by getting stronger. But again, that only works up to a point. Once you start dealing with, athletes who then reach a certain level of strength, you then have to kind of address other qualities related to their speed. So if you're asked the question, can strength training improve speed? If you're just asked that, you can say yes. There does reach a point, though, however, when strength training is really just done to support. Again, you never stop strength training. You never say, oh, someone's strong enough they could stop lifting weights, because the lifting weights then serves just a different purpose for that individual that has to run fast. Again, the most important factor is rate of force development. How fast can you produce force? So, but again, force is still a part of that equation, and we tend to neglect that. So, and that's where a lot of athletes can get faster just by getting stronger. Repeat sprint ability is important for team sports. So this is where a lot of the current conditioning practices, and in my programming class, it's hard again in working with students simply because we all have our sport experiences in dealing with coaches, and coaches tend not to address this quality very good. Again, most of your team sports are alactic with aerobic recovery, but yet what you end up seeing is a lot of medium intensity running, a lot of anaerobic glycolytic work, which doesn't really correlate. The problem with glycolytic and training the lactic acid system at a large volume is that you don't run fast enough to improve speed, and you can't recover from it in less than 48 hours. So the problem becomes is if you're doing a lot of lactic and anaerobic glycolytic running, you're actually taking away from the ability to improve speed. Because remember, when you're doing that stuff, albeit the effort is high, you're not running at full speed because you can't. The fatigue factor is what ends up limiting you with that. But the unfortunate thing is a lot of sport coaches, and sometimes it's just kind of the way as we're coming up playing sports when we're younger, that we're kind of faced with, because they do that, in an effort to build mental toughness and conditioning, which again, even the conditioning that they're building in the end ends up not being specific to the sport. So I have here, and I was referencing this because the full discussion that I gave on this involved rehab, but you want to introduce sprinting drills as early as possible. Now, when we're talking in the off season, and we'll see this in some other classes, you have to obviously watch, because if they're just ending a previous season, there's a lot, they've already endured a good amount of neuromuscular stress. But there are simple drills that you can do. We'll illustrate some of the power speed drills. And there's the toe over knee drill that can really be a good early introduction to some sprint technique work. Okay, so looking at the different aspects of sprinting and some of the mechanics involved. So one important thing to note as it relates to the non-track athletes, most team sports function in the area 5 to 30 meters. So what this means is that the bulk of the sprinting getting done is actually getting done, and it's utilizing acceleration. Now, there are certain athletes in certain sports and certain positions in certain sports where they will hit max speed distances and mechanics, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But for the most part, the bulk of your team sports is really functioning here. So what this highlights is the importance of acceleration mechanics for helping to improve this aspect of the athlete's speed. So some things we want to look at, the angle of the lower leg and the line of extension. So one thing you look at when you see here is what they refer to as a positive shin angle. Okay, so if you're looking here at the lower leg, you have this what they call positive shin angle. And if you look at the line of extension here with the back leg, so you see here your triple extension basically occurring here at the ankle, knee, and hip. So some important things to look at is don't force the stride length. So obviously the stride length here does tend to go out. If you force it too much, it's actually going to cause braking forces and cause you to slow down. So that's an important thing to note. There's greater horizontal forces getting placed because basically you're starting to accelerate out and improve your speed. From a muscle action standpoint, the acceleration mechanics are slightly more quadricep dependent, more anterior chain dependent. Now, you're still looking at this. If you look at this back leg, there's still a great deal of extension going on. So the glutes are very important in this extension, obviously because they're extending from this position here. The glutes are more important. The hamstrings are still going to be active, but they're not quite as predominant as they are as with max speed mechanics. Okay, so the hamstrings still do have to work. The glutes are probably even more important in this regard, but that there is much more quadricep action because there's much greater knee extension that has to occur. If you're looking, again, if you're looking at this front leg, obviously when this comes down, the knee is going to extend along with hip extension, so the quadriceps are going to be more active with that. And strength development, see, this is where strength development is more relevant because your contact time is greater. If you think about when you're accelerating into a sprint, your feet are in contact with the ground for a longer period of time than they are, say, with max speed mechanics. So really, your strength development is more important and more relevant for acceleration than it is for max speed. So now here's where we look at max speed. So now you could just notice, looking at the picture, comparing and contrasting what the individual looked like during acceleration versus what they look like once they're kind of reaching max speed distances. Okay, so we're obviously seeing already a much more upright posture. So there will be some very slight minimal forward lean, but the posture is much more upright. You see that the hamstrings now take on a much greater emphasis. So with maximum speed is a little bit more posterior chain dominant, and the hamstrings get more involved. There's greater vertical forces associated with this. So whereas the horizontal forces with acceleration were more important, now the vertical forces are increasing, and part of that is because the angle of the body is starting to change. So another interesting thing to note is that sprint action is affected by the arms. So the arms work to counterbalance what's going on at the hips, and they do assist with force development. The movement of the arms also kind of dictates what's going on with the opposite lower extremity. So the arm action is important. A lot of times athletes, again, tend to neglect that. Now, obviously, when you're talking team sports, there's implements. For instance, in field hockey, they have to carry a stick. It's still important to work on good arm action, because you have to think about if their arm action isn't good when they're not carrying something, when they have to carry something or there's an implement involved, it's going to impact it even more. So make it as good as you can without the implement, and then when the implement's in place, they could obviously work with it. Here's an interesting thing, and we mentioned this a little bit when we were referring to power speed drills in regards to the butt kicker exercise. Again, during the swing phase, the hamstrings do not actively contract at the knee. So during the swing phase, as the leg is coming through, the knee flexion that occurs is a result of what's called dynamic coupling. And actually, you actually don't want too much hamstring activity during the swing phase, because that's actually what can then lead to injury. So the hamstring is actually more important. The action of the hamstring is actually more important relative to the hip extension that's occurring after the contact occurs with the ground when the foot reaches the contact phase. And whereas we said that with acceleration, strength is more relevant, here reactive ability becomes more relevant. So much, again, if you think about what's happening with max speed, there's not as much ground contact time. So strength doesn't become as important of a factor during max speed distances as it does with acceleration distances. When you get to this point, reactive ability is more relevant because your foot is not in contact with the ground as much. So now in regards to team sports, as we said, most of the distances covered are somewhere in the realm of 50 to 30 meters. Now, there are some sports, and are instances in sports where athletes do sprint the distances related to max speed. So for most field-based sports, they usually hit this around the 40 to 60 meter mark as far as hitting max speed. And if you think about just the size of most fields, that makes sense, because really, you look at most playing fields, for instance, a football field, the inside the end zones is 100 yards. So, you're obviously never going to sprint much more than that, very seldomly, unless the only way you'd sprint more than that is if you're returning a kickoff from the back of the other end zone, and even then you're probably not running in a straight line that entire distance. So, again, those would be the distances you'd be looking at for max speed. Obviously soccer, lacrosse, some of those sports you can hit that, more readily. But obviously, again, we come back to the acceleration being the more important of the two for team sports. Okay, so some of these activities we've already kind of covered and gone over. So the push-up into sprint, the jump back to sprint, these are all good acceleration activities. A falling acceleration is nothing more than letting your body weight fall forward. You catch yourself and run. Again, that would be another drill that can be utilized. Hill sprints work really good for acceleration. So if someone has trouble with acceleration mechanics, maybe they're not strong enough to take the body angles, what you do is, instead of making them angle their body towards the ground, angle the ground towards them. So hill sprints work really good at doing that, because they basically automatically are in a position without having to change their body. It's the ground that you're changing. Sled sprints, because they encourage that forward lean. And then jumps with deeper knee bends. So all of that stuff can definitely play a role in as far as assisting with this. Remember, I said with the jump training, you pick your jumps based upon what it is you're working on. So jumps with deeper knee bend, greater amount of hip extension that has to occur. You would be working more typically towards acceleration with those. So here's another acceleration activity. It's a medicine ball throw acceleration. So if you watch that, notice how what happens here as you throw the ball, you automatically kind of put your body in position to sort of be in that acceleration mode. The trick is, as you throw out, so notice how as you throw out, your body's kind of already sort of leaning forward as you make the throw. So that's what's going to allow that to take place. This is a little bit more of an advanced drill, but it's definitely something you could utilize. Okay, so as we said, looking at some other acceleration activities. So even here, and looking at this picture, you can see just using this type of sled, or they call this a prowler, you can kind of get that angle. So you can work this from the standpoint of making it more velocity based with lighter weight, or you can build more of the strength aspect of it by loading it with heavier weight. Again, you don't want to load it with too much weight that it's going to mess up the mechanics, but doing it slower with heavier weight has also been shown to have benefits as well. So some other special strength-based exercises you can do. A pistol squat works really well. Different lunge variations with hip flexion will kind of strengthen you position-wise for this. All your different split squat variations, various step-ups with hip flexion, and then again, heavy prowler and sled. So, there was at one time they said for sprint-based activities, if you were going to load a sled, you only ever wanted to load it up with 10%, no more than 10% of your body weight. A lot of research is actually finding that heavier sleds can actually benefit. Now, there reaches a point where if you're loading up a sled so much and you're kind of just pushing it with really short steps and enforcing bad technique doesn't work, but you can certainly do heavier sled, particularly as it relates for acceleration purposes, because what it does is it's going to teach you how to push with that force into the ground. And again, while it's not velocity specific, force application wise, it can kind of reinforce that. So these are some non-sprint based things that you could certainly do to kind of help with acceleration properties. Okay, so here's a pistol squat. So a pistol squat, again, so you're working a much greater range of motion. Now, again, this is obviously a special strength exercise as it relates to acceleration. Okay, so it's not a sprint-based movement, and it's not velocity specific, but it strengthens those kind of deeper knee joint angles that you would see with acceleration sprinting. Okay, so here's a step up with hip flexion. So you're doing a reverse lunge first into a step up. So reverse lunge, step up with the opposite foot and flex the hip. So if you're looking for some special strength variations or some different exercises, you could accompany that with these movements as well. Okay, now here's going to be a lunge. If you notice here, I have a band wrapped around my ankle, and I'm going to do a resisted hip flexion motion with this. So I'm doing a reverse lunge, and then I'm resisting hip flexion on the opposite side. Okay, so now we're going to look at max speed activities. Okay, so maximum speed, obviously, again, we're looking now more at the posterior chain issue. So a lot of the special strength exercises, like I showed you the special strength exercises for acceleration, a lot of the special strength exercises will be more posterior chain dominant, as opposed to having more knee action taking place. So a lot of hip extension strengthening. So upright sled walking, obviously, as far as sprinting activities, flying sprints. So what a flying sprint is instead of having, typically when you have a sprint, you have a set distance that you sprint for, a start and a finish. What we actually do with a flying sprint is you take a running start. So, say you're going to do a 30 yards for a flying sprint, what you'd actually do is run to the, start to build up your speed to the starting line and then take off. That's actually one of the more stressful types of sprints to do, that can work really well to building up top end speed. Obviously, you would increase your sprint distances because you have to hit your max velocity, and then you want the jumps to be more elastic reactive. Okay, so instead of the jumps, having deeper knee flexion and hip flexion angles when you're doing them, they're going to be more reactive based. Okay, so you get a lot more reactive abilities, a lot more ankle action taking place. So here's a kind of a unique hip extension activity. And again, any type of activity that works hip extension, the nice thing about this is you're actually working the eccentric at the knee, which that becomes important with maximum speed to slow down the lower leg as it comes through the swing phase. So if you watch what's going on, you're doing a glute bridge and getting the resisted extension with the chain. And then as you come down, you kind of work, slowly extend your knee, so the hamstrings are controlling that motion as you're coming down. So there you're working the hip extension strength, and you're actually working the hamstrings from an eccentric perspective, which when you look at the knee motion, as you come through in the swing phase, the hamstrings have to work, then they work eccentrically at the knee to kind of decelerate the lower leg as you come through the swing phase. So the concentric, you don't have to worry about concentric knee flexion when you're coming through in the swing phase. But what you do have to concern yourself is with the eccentric action at the knee to help decelerate the lower limb. So power speed drills, I talked about these a little bit. Again, they have kinematic likeness to sprinting. So it means what they include are, parts of the sprint cycle or aspects of it from that standpoint. And they do have an elastic reactive component, albeit at lower intensity. So again, very good for warm up, underused in rehabilitation, but even for early speed work, this stuff becomes important. Okay, so it's a good kind of introduction to speed work into the off season for these individuals. So again, just some examples here, and we've talked about these already. There's the the A and B series, which I'm actually going to show you in this presentation. Lateral skips, backward skips, butt kickers, but again, I like the modified butt kicker with hip flexion. So instead of just rapidly flexing your knees and having your heel hit the back of your thigh glute region, what you're actually doing is you're still hitting the back of your thigh and glute, but you're flexing your hip as you do it. That's actually much more representative of what's going on during the running cycle, as opposed to just rapidly flexing your knees with your hip in an extended position. Straight leg bounds, ankling. So you've seen some of those videos, and if you don't remember them, go back to the power speed video that I posted in the folder, because it shows some of those. And you could also do single leg variations of these. So, say for instance, and this is actually directly from a rehab protocol for track and field athletes. And I've used this with athletes early on. If they have, a more severe hamstring strain, do single leg variations where they do the movement with their good side and they keep their bad side in an extended position, because really when you're running and moving, because of what happens at the pelvis, there's still some stress that gets placed on that other side, but it's light enough stress that it starts to help with the remodeling process. And again, not to mention the neuromuscular stimulus that you can gain from it. So here's the A series. So here's your A march. So you'll have a march, a skip, and a run. Here's the A march. So you'll notice the hip flexion, the ankle dorsiflexion. So again, front side mechanics. Here's your A skip. So this is just to work on the knee drive and hip drive with all of these. And here's your A run. So your A run is just basically your high knee. So that would be your A series, and then here's your B series. So the only difference between the A and the B is with the B, what you're now getting is that pawing back action. So what you'll actually see is, instead of just having the front side hip and knee flexion, when the hip's going into extension, you'll see the lower leg kind of loosen and kind of almost have like somewhat of a whipping action as it comes down. Now, this is a much harder drill to teach, because what people end up doing a lot of times is they end up kind of almost slapping their foot down too far out in front of their center of gravity, and you don't want that. The foot should basically still land basically right underneath the body or close to it. Okay, maybe a slight, slight amount of just slightly anterior to the center of gravity, but it shouldn't be out in front too far. So you'll notice here, so kind of notice how the lower leg kind of comes back, but the key with this, so you'll notice, so when this lands, it's still landing kind of in line with my center of gravity. Okay, it's not landing out in front. What I was referring to earlier, and I've seen this a lot, particularly with younger kids, what they'll do is they'll actually kind of whip their foot down and it'll strike out here, and then they'll kind of pull themselves over it. You don't want them doing that. If they're doing that, they're actually stressing the hamstrings more than they should. And they're just, again, it's encouraging bad mechanics. So again, look where the foot landed, again, and look where the center of gravity is. That's where you want it to be, okay? So foot strike should be pretty much right in line or slightly in front. But what you don't want is, as they're kind of bringing the leg through, you don't want their foot striking out in front and then them pulling themselves over. Here's the B skip. Then you have the B run. The B run gets a little tough. I hold my form here pretty good. What becomes a problem with the B run is the person tends to start to lean back as they're doing it. So I'm keeping my torso at a pretty good angle here, but what you'll sometimes see, they call it the drum major error. So if you ever see a drum major come out when they're doing something, they come marching out, they kind of are leaning backwards when they do it. So you want to make sure the torso is still staying upright. I do a pretty good job of that, but this is definitely a difficult part of these drills, is the B run, because you're now not just driving up your hips and your knees, you're trying to get that, again, that loosening action at the lower leg to kind of replicate that pawing back motion as you come through. Now, there's some other things you can also do. So again, whether you're limited by injury or you just don't want the stress, particularly early on in the season, there's some ways you can actually use a stationary bike for speed work. So again, reasons why you would do this, early off season, maybe you don't have good places to sprint, you're limited by the weather in your indoor facilities. Or you just don't want the stress of the foot contact, because obviously you don't have that 5 times your body weight hitting the ground when you're on a bike, because it's essentially non-weight bearing. So you can use a stationary bike for a limited amount of time and kind of still work this. Now, whether you're working acceleration or max speed, beyond the time frames you have, which I have listed here, for instance, for acceleration, you would want to maybe put the bike seat slightly lower to work the ranges of motion, because obviously if you're working with a slightly lower seat on the bike relative to the person, their hip flexion and knee flexion will go through that greater range of motion. That's as opposed to max speed, where you may want the bike seat slightly higher and they're kind of working more of that hip extension and through smaller ranges of motion. Obviously, you don't want this bike seat so high that they have to reach so much that it kind of, again, messes up the mechanics of what they're doing. But you could put it up slightly higher, and then this way here they'll have to kind of work more of that hip extension and more of that posterior chain when they're actually carrying that out. And those are the time frames. So if you were doing sprints on the bike, that's approximately the distances and the times you would be working for. And then extensive tempo work. So again, people always say, well, aerobic development is important in speed power athletes and team sports, but the issue becomes how aerobic work gets done. And again, we think of aerobic work, we automatically think of distance running and running for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, etc. at a certain amount of time. Well, for athletes where speed and power dictates their success, and that's pretty much in a lot of your sports, that's not the best way to do it. And one of the ways you can do it while still working on speed is to do what's called extensive tempo work. What that is you basically run distances in interval fashion, and the idea is keep them in the 60 to 75 percentile, because what that'll do is keep you in the aerobic area and will not be considered high intensity. Okay, so this would be considered a low intensity element. You'll basically do those in interval fashion, and again, the distance will be dependent on the sport. So for instance, you may have situations where individuals will, run, say, 100-meter tempos. So maybe for some athletes that do run further distances in their sport, you may do 100-meter or 100-yard tempos at 75%. They would rest for a certain amount of time for recovery in between, and you would use here what would be called a series intervals, where you would group a bunch of sets together in a series, and then take a slightly longer rest interval between series in order to make sure. The key here is keeping it aerobic. Okay, that's the biggest key when you're doing tempo work, because if you don't keep it aerobic, it's going to impact their recovery, and it's going to impact what the energy system you're working on. Okay, so you can do this as for recovery purposes and to work on the aerobic development in team sports. The other thing too is indirectly it's going to help with speed, because if you think about it, number one, you're going to be running at a faster speed than you would be. So if someone goes out and someone was going to do it, if a soccer player was going to go do a 3-mile run, their overall average speed is probably not going to be upwards to 75% during that 3-mile run, because of the fact they're running at a constant speed for a long period of time. Whereas here, overall, they're keeping a much better, mechanically, they're keeping much better form, and overall, they're still running at a faster amount of speed. And again, this will complement the speed work, because it will help as far as the, working with the adaptation of keeping the motor units warm while they're actually then participating in their sport in between sprint distances during their sport. It kind of trains their body to kind of keep those motor units warm while they're actually participating in their sport. So that's some slightly further information on the sprint and speed work. As I said, you notice there were some citations throughout this presentation, and again, I don't have a works cited page because I kind of just took this from a presentation. I took some pieces of this from a presentation that I did at a conference. So certainly if you'd want to look at those resources or want to know what they are, I have no problem sharing them. But this can kind of hopefully give you some more ideas and just some slightly more depth to the sprint and speed work that we've discussed.